It's great to be here to see all of you, and I appreciated last night getting to meet a lot of people and kind of get a sense of this group, which I think is full of kindred spirits. I wanted to thank Stephanie for taking such good care of me and getting me here, and Lynette for inviting me in the first place. It's great to see my old friend Sharon Washington, who is leading you through these challenging times, and I must say you won't find a more dogged and persistent leader. I think those people on the Hill are going to have to listen. So I have a real love for the National Writing Project, although I have not been a participant in it. I always recommend that my teachers, when they graduate, find a group like the National Writing Project, because I think it's so important for educators to find networks of support where you can engage in the intellectual work of teaching and support each other, especially in times like these. So I'm so delighted to speak to this group in particular, because you do that hard work of creating networks of support for teachers. I'm here to talk about a project that's near and dear to my heart, the Storytelling Project. And my plan is basically to give you an outline of the project and the different story types and some examples of how I've used it in my context, which is an urban context in the Northeast, but I think that you can fill the story types with your own stories, and my hope is that you will, and that I'll get to hear some of those stories before I leave today. Let me see here. Just have to get used to this setup. Okay. I start with this New Yorker cartoon to illustrate how I think we typically deal with race and other uncomfortable issues of inequality in our national discourse. Here, the elephant represents our racial past and the long, complicated, and often sordid history of race relations in this country that continue today. On the analyst's couch, the elephant laments, "I'm right there and no one acknowledges me." The impetus for the Storytelling Project came from, as Stephanie said, research that I was engaged in with some of my master's students at SUNY New Paltz. My colleague Tom Meyer is here today. And we were interested in understanding how gatekeepers understand race and racism and what they think it will take to eliminate racism. And so by gatekeepers, I mean people who make decisions that have consequential effects for the students and people with whom they work. And what we noticed in interviewing, we interviewed 106 people. All were people, either teachers or principals or people who worked in human services in various positions. And what we noticed in analyzing the data was that white people and people of color often tell different stories about race. And people would often invoke stories to make a point in the interviews. Broadly speaking, white interviewees tend to talk about the progress we've made, how far we've come, how much better things are, and in some cases that we've gone too far, that racism has been eliminated and things are basically equal now. People of color more often would talk about the ongoing challenges they face in their daily lives because of barriers based on race. So these are different stories. Now, not every person of color told such stories. Not every white person told such stories. Of course, there are whites who see and talk about racial stories and barriers to progress, and a few people of color who talk about as racism's over and done with. But by and large, we hear different stories from these two groups. And that got me interested in the whole notion of story and the purpose of story, the functions of stories in maintaining or challenging the status quo. How we talk about race matters. While talk in and of itself won't dismantle racism, a critical analysis of how we talk about race and racism, the kinds of stories we tell, provides a way for us to understand the racial system we have inherited, recognize the different experiences that white people and people of color have in this racial system, come to grips with the work still to be done to eliminate and dismantle racism, and live up to the promise of equality in our national rhetoric and governing documents. Here we are, 50 years since the historic Brown decision, and our public schools are more segregated than ever. Some schools in major cities operate, according to the Civil Rights Project, as apartheid schools. Now think about that. As Justice Blackmun put it in his writing on the Bakke decision, to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race, acknowledge the elephant in our national room. There is no other way. The Storytelling Project is an attempt to look at how we talk about race and racism and try and influence the discussion so that we take account of our racial past and think more critically and creatively about how to dismantle it and move to a vision that's more inclusive of all of us. I was inspired by the Echoes of Brown project that Michelle Fine and her students engaged in New York City, and you may, I don't know, have any of you heard of it, Echoes of Brown? It's a wonderful project. You can get a book DVD from Teachers College Press, but essentially what they did was they interviewed young people and engaged them in research, high school kids, in research about segregation 50 years after Brown, what was going on in their schools. And these young people reported their research in writing, but also in performance. And I was fortunate enough to see their performance of the data, and it was really powerful. One thing that really struck me was their insistence that what the adults were calling the achievement gap needed to be called the opportunity gap. And so their critical understanding of what was happening in their schools was inspirational to me and gave me the idea of working with a team of artists and educators in developing the Storytelling Project. So this is an image of my team. It was a multidisciplinary, multi-age, and multi-race team. We developed a process of working together using various genres to study racism, and that was the impetus for the Storytelling Project model I share with you today. As Maxine Green says, when we begin moving between immediacies, and I see part of that as engagement with the arts, and writing certainly is an art with which you're all quite familiar and engaged, and general categories, the analysis of complex social issues. When we move between those two, we participate in some dimensions we could not know if imagination were not aroused. And I think it's really important because a lot of times the didactic teaching we do on these issues, the sociological level, if you will, never connects with the personal level. And we need to connect the personal with the social to really make sense of what's happening in our world. Of course, the personal alone can be anemic because as individuals we're not very powerful. But connecting our personal stories with the broader narratives is a way of finding some collective power. So this is the Storytelling Project model, and you'll notice that in the center of the model is creating a counter-storytelling community. And I'll take a few minutes on this because it's so critically important. So I'm going to talk about how we developed and used this model to look at race and racism, but it's also been used by my students to look at sexism, to look at classism, to look at immigration issues, and I'm hoping that you'll find ways to use it in your work and adapt it to the issues that are most compelling in your local communities. Just briefly, and then I'll go through each story type in more detail. The stock stories are the mainstream stories. These are the most visible and ubiquitous, and they're the ground from which the analysis develops. These are the stories that maintain the status quo. Concealed stories are the multitude of stories that exist outside of those status quo narratives, and you're probably familiar with all of these stories that fight so hard to get heard. And those stories give us a way to talk back to analyze, to see the problems, to see the missing dimensions in the stock stories. We also inherit a history of people in this country from all racial groups who have struggled against racism. And their resistance stories are inspiration and sources of ideas and support and strategies that we can build on if we learn those stories. But of course, they're often not taught in the mainstream curriculum. So we have to excavate those resistance stories so that we can see the shoulders on which we stand and join that movement forward, that historical trajectory. And then finally are the emerging transforming stories, because we're part of this process. It's not finished and done. We contribute to and help move it forward through the stories that we create in our own lives today. Now, you'll notice that there's an arrow going to action and change, which is the direction we hope to go in through this analysis. And there's also an arrow going back to stock stories. And that's to remind us that we never are finished. There are always new issues that come to our attention that we may not have been aware of in our original analysis, and we have to stop and take care to integrate those. So, for example, we've often talked about racism in this country as a black-white issue, and that's been a deep part of our history. But there are many other groups within the group people of color and multiple histories that need to be taken into account. Or we are recreating a stock story that doesn't allow us to be inclusive in our images for change. Or including the issues that GLBT people bring to the table is another, has been another, in the process of historically looking at issues of oppression, has been something that helped us rethink stock stories that we thought we had already analyzed clearly. I hope that makes sense. So, as I said, at the heart of the storytelling model is creating a counter-storytelling community. And this is a community of diverse members in all the diversity that your community represents, wherever and whatever it may be. So the first question is, who's not at the table, who should be? Whose voices need to be involved in this group for us to really get a handle on the issues that we're facing? We want a counter-storytelling group where issues of social power and privilege can be exposed and dissected so that we can begin to imagine together more inclusive and democratic arrangements. And it's important to identify the terms of engagement since we come to the table from different locations. Not all stories are equal. Some stories are supported and reinforced by the power structure, the stock stories, while others have to fight tenaciously to be heard. As Bell Hooks says, quote, "For some, openness is not about the luxury of will I choose to share this or tell that, but will I make it through? Will I stay alive?" We want to invite kitchen talk. And that's the honest, straight-up conversation that people have in the kitchen, in contrast to the sugar-coated living room conversation that's too polite to get to the heart of the matter. Recognizing that people of color often bear the weight of talking about race, we want to ensure that white members take on our fair share of the burden in such discussions. We do this by developing guidelines explicitly with these goals in mind, ways that we can discuss racism openly, listen respectfully to each person's voice and story, scrutinize our stories in terms of their relation to power that differentially mutes or privileges particular stories, thus reproducing what we're hoping to dismantle. So we ask people to operate on their learning edge, to get out of their comfort zones, to really push beyond what feels safe and not retreat to a comfortable position. This quote from one of the white students I worked with, I think, captures an essential feature of counter-storytelling community. When we see ourselves as contributing to a fabric, we're no longer invisible threads, on the one hand, or entire bolts full of lonely self-importance, but a community. So how do we create such communities? First, As I said, we want to ensure that everyone's at the table, that our community represents the full diversity of its members. Then we want to build connections. If people don't know each other well, how do we create a web of commonalities and shared interests that can hold us through the difficult work ahead? That will be conflictual and tumultuous feelings will arise when we confront normalizing patterns and discourses. So how do we create that web of support? Here, this is a group of teachers we worked with in New York City. And they were, this is the sort of community building part of our getting together, where they're generating stories about advice they would give to a new teacher, and then they have to perform their stories. So they're already, working together. They're taking some risks together as we start coming together. Then we want to establish the ground rules for our work together that explicitly address how we can share risk equitably, acknowledging the ways that risk is distributed differently depending on one's social location. And we want to construct guidelines that support risk-taking and the possibility that we can move to a new place if we're courageous. Here you can see some of the guidelines developed in that particular workshop. Take ownership for your learning, do your own research to find out what you need to know. Many of these are familiar to you, I'm sure. Use I statements, ask for clarification, keep an open mind, bear witness and be present. Sit with it for a while and name emotions as a way to move forward. Say ouch when you need the group to pause. In chapter 6 of my book, I describe this 5-day institute with teachers in great detail, and I discuss a moment in the group's process when the conflict first emerged, and we needed the guidelines to help us move through that conflict. And it's really important. I think it's gotten kind of pat to say, oh, well, we develop guidelines, but we don't follow them. We really need to have guidelines that we can follow when the going gets rough, and they have to be addressed the very first time conflict emerges, for the group to have trust that those guidelines are going to hold the group through the challenges ahead. So we start with stock stories. And these are the historical and contemporary tales produced and reproduced in mainstream chronicles, texts, monuments that we all imbibe from birth. Unblemished stories about American democracy, westward expansion, a land of immigrants where anyone, regardless of birth, can attain the American dream. We're all familiar with these stories. And they are stories that tend to explain the status quo, as to explain and justify the status quo rather than challenge it. I call them stock because they're kind of kept in stock like canned goods on the shelf. They're not really fresh or new or immediate. We just pull them off whenever we need a ready response to challenge. And they essentially are ways to not rock the boat. So one stock story I talk about in the book is, I don't see color, I just see people. Now, that's, physiologically a strange thing to say, and it's also socially an insulting thing to say. So what do we really mean? That's not what we mean. When we say that, we mean, I won't see racism. I don't want to rock the boat. I think that's what it means. I understand the intention of people say I treat everyone equally, but it usually is raised exactly when a racial issue has hit the table. So it's really important to look at how that stock story functions to prevent honest dialogue and moving forward. As canned stories, they're stale and predictable, but they have a long shelf life. We want to get to the fresh, unscripted stories. Now, and I just wanted to say about this image, I think that this image really kind of captures the way stock stories work. They're, as you see, the people on top are going about their business completely oblivious to the concealed stories beneath. And it's not conscious. It's usually just part of business as usual. So we have to be really proactive and thoughtful to penetrate this normalizing patterned way of living our lives. And I would say this is true for in any area of social injustice, that we need to be proactive to realize, to look at the ways in which things get reproduced even outside of our desire and awareness. I don't know if you're familiar with Beverly Tatum's notion of the moving walkway at the airport. Whether you stand still or actively walk, you still get to the same end. And the only way not to get to the same result is to turn around and actively walk the other way. And I think that captures what the consciousness that we need to develop. So I want to look at one stock story, the American Dream. And this is a canonical stock story. It embodies the ideal that America, unlike other societies where inherited wealth and title determine life chances and opportunities, here, anyone who works hard enough to get ahead can ensure that their children will be better off than those of previous generations. And this is a dream that inspires and draws people to our shores. It's a dream that inspires people who are poor to aspire to a different possibility. I mean, to all the people who've been subjugated in this society, they embrace it as much as anyone who has achieved success through the American dream. The centrality of this story can be seen in the frequency with which politicians invoke it, politicians from both major political parties, in their speeches and public utterances. We do an activity in the Storytelling Project where we look at the speeches from the 2004 presidential conventions that were given by Barack Obama, who was a junior senator from Illinois, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, who I don't think yet was governor of California. Maybe I think he might have been. And it's very interesting to analyze their speeches because they, while they have some differences, they're kind of different versions of the American dream. They have a big area of overlap. If you think of a Venn diagram, you can analyze the way in which the speeches are separate. Schwarzenegger talks more about rugged individualism and making it on one's own. Barack Obama talks more about community and support. So it's a liberal and conservative version of the American dream with a lot of overlap in the center. And our question is, what is not in either speech? What's outside both speeches together? And that tends to be the challenges of people who, despite following all the tenets of the American dream, still don't make it, still are barred from its promises. Now, I bring this slide just to show that compared to other developed countries, the U.S. in fact offers less opportunity. This slide compares relative mobility through comparing parental income with that of their children as a measure of relative mobility. And you'll see that a number of countries, including Denmark, Canada, Germany, France, have more relative mobility than the United States. Measured in absolute terms, American men in their 30s are now earning less than their fathers did. Those in their 30s in 2004 had a median income of about $35,000 a year. Men in their father's cohort, who are now in their 60s, had a median income of about $40,000 when they were the same age. The up escalator that's supposed to ensure that each generation will do better than the last seems no longer to be working well. So in a way, we're all now experiencing what those who've been marginalized all along experienced. And it's having an impact on people's faith in the American dream, which, I think is something to think about. It is something to aspire to in this country, that people can get ahead through their own labor. But that seems to be fading in the current moment. And here's one reason why. If you haven't seen the documentary film Inside Job, which won an Academy Award, an Oscar, I'm so happy to say, because now it'll come back to the theaters. It's really worth seeing because it explains in a very clear, understandable language how the recent meltdown happened and what has happened since. And it I think shows the way in which the domination of our politics and media by Wall Street has created such vast inequalities in the country, and is something we have to wrap our minds around if we're going to challenge that and create a big enough movement of ordinary people to fight back against that entrenched power. So that's one stock story that we analyze in the storytelling project. Concealed stories, as I said, are those stories that challenge the stock story. They're the stories of the ordinary people who lost their houses with subprime mortgage meltdown. They're the people who work hard, but they're not. Their income's not rising. They're the people who are trying to save money for their kids to go to college, but it's getting harder and harder because of the what's happened to the economy. So all of these stories are really important to listen to. And in terms of racism, they're the stories that narrate the way that race shapes life differentially and dispute tales of unblemished colorblindness, opportunity, continuous progress that we so like to invoke to avoid having to deal with this reality. The term concealed is intended to signify that these stories are not invisible. They're just below the surface, not so much unknown as constantly overshadowed, pushed back into the margins, or conveniently forgotten or repressed. Like unwelcome company, concealed stories disconcert our stock stories, challenging our complacency and assumed normality by insisting on a different accounting of experience. And through their rendering of different experiences, they expand our awareness or our view of what's going on in the world, and thus our capacity to act on for change. Now, in your world, if you look at the literature of Toni Morrison or the work of Linda Christensen and Maisha Fisher, their work is about pulling out these concealed stories. Probably your work in the writing project is to make space for the concealed stories that keep getting pushed into the margins, to bring those forward so we can listen to and learn from those stories, so we have a fuller vision of reality, of our, as what Spirit said last night in her wonderful talk, urging us to learn from our shared collective history. I love that phrase that she used. I've been drawing on, I'm just going to share a few. I've been drawing on nonfiction and historical accounts, and these are just a few of the books I've read recently that really give us concealed stories that we haven't known that we need to know. So has anyone read this book by Doug Blackman? I highly recommend it. He's a journalist from Atlanta, and he went all over the South going through records and documents in courthouses, and has documented a history of neo-slavery that followed the Emancipation Proclamation, where people were literally picked up off the road, put into camps and forced labor to work for corporations in the South or farm plantations, up until World War II. This is an amazing story. Sundown Towns by James Loewen. Anybody read this one? This is another fascinating book about concealed stories. James Loewen is from Illinois, and he had heard in his growing up this term sundown towns, which were towns that either implicitly or literally had signs at the gate to the town that people of color better be out by dark and not allowed to live there. And he thought he was interested in exploring these towns, and he thought he might find 10 or 20. And what he discovered was thousands across the country. And in some areas, they would exclude Chinese Americans or Native Americans, Jewish Americans, Mexican Americans. It depended on the region. But, we think that the racial makeup of our country just sort of came about. And his book shows that it was actually designed. It was actually deliberate and intentional. Why the racial distribution in our country is as it is. Important to know about, and a very well-written story. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Anyone familiar with this one? Okay, this is a recent book by a woman, a poor Southern tobacco farmer, African American, who worked the same land as her slave ancestors. And she was taken, her cells were taken from the colored wards of Johns Hopkins Hospital in the 1950s without her knowledge, and became one of the most important tools in medicine. The first human cells grown in culture that are still alive today and still used in experiments. One quote I read, if you could pile, they call them HeLa cells, Henrietta Lacks, if all the HeLa cells ever grown were put on a scale, they would weigh more than 50 million metric tons, as much as 100 Empire State Buildings. They were used for developing the polio vaccine. They uncovered secrets of cancer, viruses, and the atom bomb's effects, and have led to important advances in vitro fertilization, cloning, and gene mapping. They've been bought and sold by the billions. Yet, she remains virtually unknown, and her family, not surprisingly, I suppose, got nothing. So the author who wrote this book wrote it partly because she had learned these stories, the story of Henrietta Lacks, from her children who were in poverty and suffering, and her desire for them to get something out of the millions of dollars, billions of dollars made off of the cells of her mother, their mother. And I'll just one more. This is a recent one, The Warmth of Other Suns, a beautiful book, just won the National Book Award. And it's about black migration from the South, and tells the story in a very powerful way that has not been told before, that shows the ways in which black migration from the South follows trajectories of all other immigrant groups, the push-pull factors of having to leave a home you love, but having to leave because it's not safe there, what it's like to venture forth into an unknown and often hostile land. It's a very powerful book, and I encourage you to check it out. So I also want to look at the way in which contemporary artists through their work show concealed stories and bring them forth for analysis. This is one example from artist Fred Wilson. It's a museum installation piece. He's an African-American artist, and this piece is called Mine, Yours. I don't know if you can see the mine and yours, but on the left we see a wooden picture frame containing an old black and white photograph. It's a portrait of 8 African-Americans, men, women, and children, and in front of the photograph, written in capital letters, is mine. On the right, 8 ceramic figurines mimic the positioning of the figures in the photograph: a cartoonish salt shaker, decorative porcelain doll, all of which were at one time popular collectibles, and I understand are having somewhat of a renaissance now. The women figures are round and plump, wearing red bandanas on their heads like Aunt Jemima. Some of the children hold watermelon rinds, popular stereotypes that translate into a discriminatory insult. And in white capital letters, he's written, yours. The quality of the 2 portraits couldn't be more different. One photo captures a proud group of related individuals. During slavery, many African Americans were forced to live in poverty, waiting hand and foot on rich families. The artist makes a powerful statement. The members in the photographs are his ancestors, and they share generations of history. They once dealt with the torment of losing their freedom, of being someone's property. Now only their images can be owned, displayed as cute novelty items. But Wilson provokes us to consider how prejudices of the past remain very much alive today, contradicted by concealed stories of people on the receiving end. Here, teachers in our storytelling project Summer Institute share and explore cultural artifacts from their families and the concealed stories in the history of their own families, and consider what happens when material that's personally meaningful to you is interpreted by outsiders who use a lens that distorts the definition rather than considering the inside stories from the people themselves. In our work with high school kids in the Bronx, Some of the concealed stories the kids raised had to do with the gentrification happening in their neighborhoods, where they're being pushed out. They can no longer afford the rents where they live because white people with more money are moving in and taking over that property. So they also talked about what it's like, the hypervisibility for them of being in a society that talks about colorblindness, and they discussed what it's like when they go downtown to 42nd Street and feel so under the eye of everyone looking at them. What are you doing? As if to say, what are you doing here? And for these young, mostly African American Latino kids, what it's like to live in this hyper-visible way, but the language is a discourse of colorblindness that doesn't give them an anchor for explaining and making sense of their own experiences. Then we turn to resistance stories, and this is a wonderful quote, I think, from Robin Kelley, who's an African-American historian at UCLA, and talks about the sources of resistance stories and what they offer us. These are the stories that narrate the persistent and ingenious ways that Americans, both ordinary and famous, we tend to hear only about the famous, from all racial groups, resist racism and challenge the stock stories that keep it in place. I thought Spirit shared with us last night some beautiful resistance stories from her mother's experience and how that has inspired her in her work today. So the resistance stories come from concealed stories that are passed on orally or documented in writing about the small and large ways that people resist and fight for justice. You could see Howard Zinn's History of the American People for lots of examples of resistance stories that you typically don't hear in mainstream history books. I think there are also resistance stories to be found in the magazine Rethinking Schools. Are you familiar with that? Rethinking Schools is a magazine written by teachers for teachers. You can get it online. It's very inexpensive, but it has curriculum and essays written by teachers, and it's a really fantastic resource. So www.rethinkingschools.org. Teaching Tolerance is another source of resistance stories. It's a magazine that put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center that also tries to highlight the ways in which ordinary people resist and challenge the status quo, both historically and today. The dictionary defines resistance using terms such as confrontation, opposition, struggle, and conflict that typically have negative connotations. But we look at resistance as healthy, as in the ability of an organism to ward off what is damaging. Just so, resistance to racism and other forms of injustice is healthy for our body politic. It makes our society stronger, healthier, more resilient, more democratic, and more able to foster the well-being of all of its people. Conflict is inevitable when anti-racist ideals and principles clash with a status quo that passively allows racism and other forms of injustice to continue. But conflict can also be dynamic, catalyzing our sense of being morally alive, actively engaged, and willing to struggle with others toward a better world. Such stories, as Robin Kelley says, provide cognitive maps of the future, of the world not yet born, that can inspire and guide us today. I share this image by artist David Avalos, which takes a stock story, pulls forward concealed stories in order to resist and challenge the stock story. So here he critically examines the stock story of westward expansion and acknowledging the racist assumptions embedded in dominant narrative stock stories that are in our cultural and historical consciousness. Here, images of the original inhabitants of this country are juxtaposed with text that describes a collective mythology of the West as a wilderness. These images came from Edward Curtis, who was commissioned in the early 1900s by J.P. Morgan, a familiar name today, to create a photographic record of all the tribes in North America. And his images helped to establish a view of Native people as primitive and savage, with archaic rituals, beliefs, and traditions. In the introduction to his book, Curtis wrote that the value of his work was in recording the, quote, vanishing lives of a people who are rapidly losing their aboriginal character and are designed ultimately to become assimilated with the superior race. Avalos, the artist, has taken these images and cropped each figure so that the individual is facing forward and staring directly into the camera and at us, bringing forward real people who've been rendered invisible. And over their faces, he writes the word wilderness. In the top left corner, he takes the dictionary definition of wilderness, a tract or region uncultivated and uninhabited by human beings, is the first definition. And this suggests one way that the dominant culture establishes and reifies stock stories through official sources that overshadow counter-narratives and contradictory perspectives. But Avalos, by taking this and putting it together in an image, turns this concealed story about the lives of people alive today, not vanished, never was a wilderness, and confronts us with their lived reality, turning this into a resistance story. This is another project. This is by Chinese-American artist Flo Oi Wang, and it's titled Made in USA, Angel Island. Shh. It's a 3-year oral history project that explores the false identities that many Chinese immigrants were forced to assume when they were detained in the United States after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which often barred wives and children of Chinese workers living in the U.S., some of whom were already U.S. citizens, from reuniting with their families. So to avoid separation, people created, there was this elaborate network of paper people using false identity documents so that families could be reunited. And Wang's mother was one of these people. Wang tells the story of not knowing until she was in high school that her mother's false paper stated that her father was her mother's brother. This is a little hard to explain, but she didn't understand the whole history of this until she was an adult, that her mother had to pretend that her husband was her brother in order to be reunited with her family. So Wang created 25 flags for this installation, and each one commemorates the immigration story of an actual paper person like her mother. It includes audio recordings of those who were detained from Angel Island, and on each flag there's a definition of the word to interrogate, framing the outer contours. Angel Island is stenciled on one side with "shh" below it, and on each flag, Wang adds a different paper person's family secret that allowed them to enter through Angel Island. So these flags suggest the tensions embedded in the idea of a unified American culture based on democratic principles. Wang says, "I want the silence of invisibility to break the paper people narratives and eventually permeate the hearts and minds of those who will see the show." Thus, Wang turns this concealed story into a resistance story that challenges us to account for our history today. And this image I put up because there are also playful ways to challenge stock stories, and and in this needs no explanation, but it challenges us to think, what is this stock story about homeland security? Whose homeland? Who's secure in it? What are we talking about here? Okay. And then finally, we come to emerging transforming stories. And these are the new stories we construct to challenge stock stories, amplify and build on concealed and resistance stories to generate new stories that can catalyze contemporary efforts against racism and other forms of injustice. Emerging connotes the developing embryonic nature of new stories and the historical analytic roots that prepare the ground for their manifestation. And I hope it's been clear from what I've said today that these are not individual stories like on TV talk shows. These are stories that are in the sense collective, though spoken through individuals, and have deep historical roots. So I'm trying to get at the link between personal and social narrative here. Emerging as in something new or recently independent also reflects how the preceding story types have paved the way for developing the necessary critical knowledge, agency, and self-determination to construct new stories. Transforming connotes the conversion of one form of energy into another to catalyze change. And combining the two, as I said, underscores that stories arise from a careful analysis of history and culture, and showing how understanding that history and its reverberations in the present can help us develop stories that will create a different alternative. As Toni Morrison says, narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment that it's being created. And I think this quote from her suggests the power in emerging and transforming stories. Here, the teachers in our institute work on action plans for their own classrooms, where they talk about their responsibility to keep learning about concealed stories and teaching these stories to the kids with whom they work, as they help students develop their own emerging and transforming stories. A quote from one teacher: "Teaching resistance and counter stories is much more than asking higher order questions, though it is teaching students to examine and question their surroundings. It's not watering down what you teach to token holidays, but rather addressing the realities of the world and all of the difficult issues in it, such as racism, sexism, poverty, and violence, and giving students the ability to actively make change through social action projects. It's helping them realize that the society they live in is not set in stone, but rather shaped by the policies and people in it, and that they too have the power to affect change." I mentioned the Echoes Project before, so I won't go through this again, but it's a wonderful compilation of poems written by these students and read by them in their performance piece, as well as the data they collected. And I found it to be a really great prompt for writing, a great prompt for thinking critically about issues of racism, inclusion, equity, and justice. My goddaughter, like most children, has more fun playing with the bag than the toy that came in it, using her imagination to fill the bag with meaning. The Storytelling Project model invites all of us to use our imagination to envision a better future, one that includes us all. The story types are containers that you fill with your own stories, using the types as a lens for critically examining stock stories, unearthing concealed stories, finding resistance stories to inspire and guide you, and generating emerging, transforming stories in the communities where you work. And I just leave you with a free curriculum that we created. It's a free downloadable PDF that anyone can have and use, and I invite you to check it out. And I thank you for your attention today. Sure.
From a small southern town, I found that, and I almost feel like a spy sometimes when I get home, that there are concealed stories that I would consider negative stories, stories that are told among whites about blacks. And I found that I've started collecting those in a sort of anonymous way, but do you ever address that when you talk about concealed stories, and whether those stories should be told to expose some things that are still undercurrents of beliefs in the communities.
Yes, I think those stories are important to address and critique. They serve a function in supporting the stock story, because it's a way of we kind of put off. So the problem of racism is people like that, who still hold on to these archaic racist assumptions, and it kind of lets the rest of us off the hook. So I think I would want to put an analysis of those stories in context, and also look at the way in which poor people, white and black in the South and in other places, get pitted against each other in ways that allow the stock story narrative to continue unchallenged. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
And by the way, Robin Kelly's book, I think it's called Race Rebels. I think that's the one. He's written a few, but it talks about that history, the periods in U.S. history when poor people organized across race, and the way that organizing was undermined by people who were benefiting from the status quo.
I was just wondering about some of the obstacles that you are up against, and how can we as educators deal with some of the obstacles that I see even at a recent textbook adoption conference, where I can't find that much about slavery in an American history book. They seem to be pushing it aside, anything they don't really want to talk about. And there's a great book out that the author evades me now, Lies My Teacher Told Me. Oh, that's the same person that wrote Sundown Town. Okay, that's interesting. That's a great book, and I let my kids read that just so they think on their own a little bit. But I just wondered if you would address a little bit what we can do as educators to go against that and affect these gatekeepers, as you call them a little bit, to the powers that be, that, hey, this is important to talk about. Don't, because it is a blemish on our society, don't push it to the side. Let's get it out there and move on.
Yeah, that's a great question. And what you're doing, I think, is one of the ways of challenging that. I mean, you can take those textbooks and have students analyze it. Some of my students who teach social studies use the story types, teach them explicitly to their students, and have them use that framework for analyzing their own history textbooks in terms of what's missing, whose stories are being told here, what function do those stories serve, whose stories are omitted, and where can we find them. And so kids become investigators, searching for the clues, analyzing what they've been given. And James Lowen offers great counter information for them. But now with the internet and careful guidance by a teacher, you can find information that was not always so readily available. Also, Howard Zinn, there's a project called the Howard Zinn Project, and I think it's zinnproject.edu, that has all kinds of historical stories and curriculum examples, and they ask teachers to add to that resource. So it's a wonderful online resource, as is Rethinking Schools, for those kinds of stories. Pardon? Thank you. Could everyone hear that? Yes. Oh. Yeah.
Howard Zinn is C-I-N-N.
I was going to ask you how you published your stories then. I mean, on a website, or did you share them orally, or how did you do that?
Well, the stories are, I would say, the stories are local. The stories, as I said at the end, the story types are containers for the stories that people bring to them. So the stories that my students told, some of them I relate in my book, what my student teachers, their stories, and sometimes, and the kids I worked with in the Bronx, I talk about some of their stories in the book. But it's really a container, it's a vehicle for resurrecting the stories in each of our communities, in our local context, and connecting them to these broader patterns. So I think that's the important point, is where do we find those stories that have been concealed in our own context, that are being eclipsed by stock stories that kind of keep them down, and how do we create spaces where people can come together and tell those stories and use them to analyze the obstacles they face at their local level.
First, I want to say thank you for the wonderful presentation that you just gave us and for challenging us to think more deeply about race and racism. I know that inside this audience here that there are a number of teachers who teach in communities where the students that they have are primarily white students. And they really do teach in a rural community where there is very little diversity and there is very little natural conversation about race and about the importance of these counter stories. And so I'm curious, you sort of touched on it a little, but I wondered if you could kind of talk about how white teachers in white places can bring about conversations about race that are significant for their students and that can change their attitudes toward others.
There's a great book called What If All the Kids Are White? And I think it's Ramsey. Does anyone know for sure? I know it's Teachers College Press, and I think the author is Ramsey. Well, first of all, I would want to challenge the notion that in communities where all the kids look white, that there's no diversity. So I think it's important to make room for the diversity that exists in any group, whether class, race, immigration status, ethnic heritage. All of those things are face stock stories that kind of stereotype and sanitize people's actual lives. So I think I would start there, and that provides a basis for then understanding the way other people's stories, who they may not know, get eclipsed in the same way. So that would be one way you could work with that.
I was intrigued by your statement that about kitchen talk. What I wrote down was ensure that white people take on their share of the burden, and I'm wondering how that process works in terms of how do you do this without having, because the experience of friends and family. A lot of the complaints are if there is a diverse group that white people are taking over the conversation. How do you create the ambiance where people are taking their share of the burden but are not talking for everybody as though they know what they're, that they know everything that they're talking about? Did I make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. And I think I didn't make up this idea of guidelines. A lot of people use it in their work. But I think what may be a contribution of this work is the critical importance of talking about positionality, of saying we don't all come to the table with the same amount of social support for our stories. So given that, what are some guidelines that we can create for ourselves that will make it possible to kind of mute or downplay the dominant stories so that we make room for the submerged stories, and make that explicit. And I think that's really important. And then, as I said, the first time that gets violated with the guideline, what you've set up as guidelines, you have to stop and address it, because I think too often we set up guidelines and we kind of forget about them. They're off on the side. And then people come to their experiences, wow, this isn't a safe place where these guidelines are going to be followed, and I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And then we've undermined what we want to accomplish. But I think that people can appreciate, it's hard. And, and to name it, it's uncomfortable. You're going to hear things you don't want to hear. That's hard. We acknowledge that. But can you find a learning edge? Can you get out of the comfort zone of being, and for white people, there's a comfort zone. We don't have to address racism. We can go through our lives pretty much ignoring it. That's the comfort zone. So how do we keep stepping into a learning edge that's a little less comfortable and saying, wow, let me pay attention to what's going on here. And how can I really listen closely to what other people have to say, and how can I honestly share what I know, even though I don't know everything and I never will, but how can I honestly share from my own experience of the way in which I've been privileged? How can I share in a way that will open up the conversation, that will support other people as an ally in ways that will make more possible their stories to be told? It's risky work. It's not easy, and I don't advocate the notion of creating a safe space. I advocate creating a safe enough space, but we want it to be safe enough that people can take risks and know they're not going to be bashed, but challenging enough that we can actually go somewhere, that we can move further, that we can move down the road. And my experience working with college students is they are hungry for this. They are truly hungry for some real conversation about race, about other issues that they face. I taught a first-year seminar last semester called Race, Education, and Democracy. And I had a really wonderful group of first-year students. Barnard is a women's college, so these were all women. Very diverse, racially, internationally, ethnically. And we had amazing conversations. These young women were ready to go to the edge and keep talking. I mean, I've never had that experience where people started at the space that we often just get to in some other conversations. So it was great.
We have time for one more question. That's over here. I'm sure Professor Bell will also have to talk.
Hi. And one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes in dealing with these issues that we in small towns, that sometimes a lot of the resistance comes from our school board and administration, and in bringing material like this into the classroom. And I wonder, what suggestions do you have for kind of opening up that dialogue with our boards and our administrators, so that it doesn't seem like, I don't know, so that it just helps for us to be able to bring these issues up openly?
That's a great question. I think sometimes our work is with those people first. That I think we need to talk to boards, and we need to talk to people. And I think teachers who are clear about what they believe is important and can show how this is in the best interest of the children that you work with. You're the person who knows most. You're in the classroom. You know what issues kids struggle with. You know what the challenges are for creating community where all kids are valued and respected. So I think that expertise needs to be shared with others in positions of authority. And, there are people in those positions who are allies. And so also finding them is important. I think teachers working collectively is important. If a group of teachers say to a superintendent, look, this is what is happening in our schools, we need to address it and we have a way of doing it, they're more likely to listen. So I think it's important. I know some people say you have to be subversive, and there may be times when you close the classroom door, but I think in the interest of long-term change, you want to talk to parents, you want to talk to administrators, you want to talk to other teachers, you want to build coalitions of support. Ultimately, that's how you get to systemic change. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think it's important work. Thank you. Thank you.